It's the darkest hour before sunrise on the Sea of Galilee, and 7 men have been pulling up nothing for 8 hours straight. The water is black and still. The cold isn't winter cold. It's the kind that gets into your hands after a whole night of hauling rope for no reason. Their arms are tired. The net keeps coming up the same way it went down. Empty. These aren't 7 strangers who decided to go fishing on a whim. This is the inner circle. Men who watched water turn to wine at a wedding, who stood on a hillside when 5 loaves fed more people than they could count, who were standing outside a tomb when a dead man walked out of it, still wrapped in linen. Thomas is in this boat, the one who said he wouldn't believe until he'd touched the wounds himself, and had already touched them. And now, they're all back here, in the dark, doing the one thing they knew how to do before any of that ever started. One of them hasn't said much all night. He doesn't need to. Everyone in that boat knows what he said 3 nights before this one, standing by a fire 3 times to 3 different people who asked if he knew Jesus. I do not know him. Then a rooster. Then he went outside and wept where no one could see his face. He's not crying now. He's just pulling up an empty net like everyone else, like the last few days didn't happen, except they did, and that's exactly the problem. The gospel that was supposed to be ending. Thomas had already knelt. The disciples had already received the Spirit. John had already written the sentence that sounds like a closing line. Doesn't end. It starts again with 7 tired men going back to the thing they knew before they ever met him. Somewhere in the dark water below that boat, there's a number waiting. A number that one of the sharpest minds the early church ever produced would spend years trying to untangle. A number that a different scholar, working from a completely different angle, would connect to something else entirely. That number is coming, but first, feel how empty this net is, one more time, because everything that happens after this only means something next to that emptiness. What most people miss about this scene is that fishing on this lake was never just a job a man picked up when he needed something to do. Herod Antipas had built his capital, Tiberias, right on this shoreline, not for the view, but for the water underneath it. Whoever controlled the lake controlled a tax base, and Rome let client kings like him keep exactly enough control to make sure the money kept moving upward. Peter had grown up on this water, knowing precisely what that meant for him personally. A fisherman didn't throw a net wherever he wanted. He paid for the right to be on that water at all, sometimes handing over close to half of whatever he pulled in, before a single fish ever fed his own family. So, when 7 exhausted men spend an entire night catching nothing, that's not a quiet inconvenience. That's a night with no income, no fish to sell, no fish to eat, and a debt to whoever held the license that didn't disappear just because the net came up empty. These men weren't out here for a hobby. They were out here because it was the only trade they'd ever known how to make money at, and they just failed at it completely. A few miles down the same shoreline sat Magdala, a town built almost entirely around salting and exporting fish. The Greek name for it, Terikeia, literally meant the place of salted fish. The catch from this lake didn't just feed local tables. It moved along trade routes that reached as far as Rome itself, which is exactly why Herod's administration cared so much about counting every net that went into the water. A fisherman wasn't competing with the man in the next boat. He was one small link in a supply chain that fed an empire, taxed at every link along the way, which makes it worth asking why Peter, specifically, would be the one to suggest going back to it. He'd spent 3 years learning a different trade entirely. And 3 nights ago, standing by a fire, he'd watched himself fail at that one too. In a culture where shame wasn't a private feeling you worked through alone, it was a public debt, repaid in public. Going back to the boat wasn't really about needing fish. It was about going back to the one place where he still knew exactly who he was supposed to be, even if he'd just proven he couldn't be trusted anywhere else. So picture what it would look like to repay that kind of debt out loud, in front of witnesses, matching the exact shape of the failure, 3 denials answered by 3 questions, beside the same kind of fire. That's not how this particular morning starts. But it's already where it's headed, long before the sun comes up. When the first gray light touches the water, a figure shows up on the shore. The disciples are about 200 cubits out. John remembers the distance with the kind of precision only someone who was actually there bothers to record. And from that far, in that light, Nobody recognizes who it is. The figure calls out across the water, and the word John uses isn't fisherman or even their names. It's paideia, a word a father uses for his own children, the word a teacher uses for students who aren't finished growing yet, but who he loves anyway. Children, do you have any fish? And they call back the one word that answers for the whole night. No, these aren't amateurs being asked an obvious question. Peter and the others grew up on this lake. They know its currents, its cold spots, where the fish gather and where they don't bother looking. And a stranger standing on a beach, far enough away that his face is still a blur, tells them which side of the boat to try. Every instinct built over a lifetime on that water says ignore him. They don't ignore him. They throw the net on the right side, and it goes tight immediately. Not slowly, not gently, but with the sudden weight of a rope that just found more than it was built to hold. They can't haul it in. They have to drag it, still in the water, all the way to the shore. And when they finally count what's inside it, John writes the number down with a precision he doesn't use anywhere else in his gospel. 153. Not many. Not a great catch. 153, counted by someone who was standing right there. Then he adds one more detail that's almost too specific to be an accident. Even with all that weight, the net didn't tear. Here's what's easy to miss the first time through this scene. This isn't the first time something exactly like this happened. 3 years earlier, at the very start of all this, Jesus had borrowed Peter's boat and told him to try again after an identical night of nothing. That catch was so large the net started to break and the boats nearly went under. Peter and the sons of Zebedee had to call for help just to keep from sinking. That was the beginning, and the nets broke. This is the end, and the net holds. That contrast is the whole reason the number matters, and the number itself doesn't let go easily once you start looking at it. In the 4th century, a bishop in North Africa sat down to study this passage closely. His name was Augustine, the same Augustine who'd later write the first true autobiography the Western world had ever produced, the one that opens with the line, "Our heart is restless until it rests in thee." Before any of that, he'd trained as a mathematician and a rhetorician, and when he looked at the number 153, he didn't see a random total. He saw a structure. 10 was the number of the commandments, the law given at Sinai. 7 was the number of the Spirit's gifts, the number that runs through Scripture from the days of creation to the last book of Revelation. 10 and 7 make 17. And when you add every whole number from 1 to 17, 1 plus 2 plus 3, all the way up, the total lands on exactly 153. To Augustine, that net wasn't just full of fish. It was law and grace, gathered into a single number, holding everyone who would ever come to God through both. But that's not the only direction this number has been read from. A different scholar, working a century later, came at it from a completely different angle. Jerome, the man who translated the entire Bible into Latin, the version that would shape the church for the next 1,000 years, wasn't interested in triangles. He was interested in fish. Ancient naturalists, he claimed, had counted exactly 153 known species in the world's waters, and to Jerome, a net holding 153 fish meant every kind was represented. Every nation, every variety of person the mission was ever meant to reach. The ancient sources Jerome was citing haven't survived intact, and the species count itself has never been confirmed exactly. That part of the puzzle stays genuinely uncertain, but the instinct behind his reading doesn't depend on the number being perfectly accurate. It depends on what kind of net this was always going to be. There's a third angle that almost nobody brings into the conversation. 600 years before this morning, the prophet Ezekiel had described a river flowing out from the temple, deep enough by the time it reached the Dead Sea to bring dead water back to life. And he named the exact places along that shore where fishermen would stand spreading their nets. En-Gedi and En-Eglaim. In the old Hebrew tradition of letter counting, those two names carry the values 17 and 153, the same two numbers Augustine reached through Greek mathematics, sitting in a completely different century, in a completely different language, with no way of knowing about a Hebrew counting tradition centuries older than his own field of study. None of these three readings cancels out the others. A mathematician's pattern, a naturalist's count, and a prophet's vision of a dead sea coming back to life all land on the same number, from three directions that never spoke to each other. Maybe that's not a coincidence stacked on a coincidence. Maybe that's just how deliberately built this number actually is. And the number wasn't the last detail that morning was built around. After the fish were cooked, Jesus turned to Peter and asked him a question, the same question 3 times. "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Each time, Peter said yes. Each time, Jesus answered with something to do, not something to feel. Feed the lambs, tend the sheep, feed the sheep. Some readers have noticed that the Greek verb shifts slightly between the first 2 questions and the third, and have built whole sermons around the idea that Jesus is asking for a deeper love than Peter is offering until he finally meets him where he is. Other scholars push back hard on that reading, pointing out that John uses the 2 verbs interchangeably everywhere else in this gospel, including to describe the Father's love for the Son. The honest answer is that nobody can prove which side is right from the grammar alone. What's harder to argue with is the number itself. 3 questions, lined up exactly against 3 denials by someone who'd kept careful count of everything else that morning too. By the 3rd question, the word John uses for what Peter felt is elupetha, a pain that runs deeper than surface sadness, the particular ache of being fully known and asked anyway. "Lord, you know everything. You know I love you." 3 questions for 3 denials. Restored, not lectured, not punished, just handed something to do in front of the same 6 men who had watched him deny it the first time. And John tells you, twice in this gospel, exactly what kind of fire was burning on that beach. Not just any fire, a charcoal fire. The smell of it. The smoke catching in the cold morning air. Peter close enough to feel the heat on his face. The same word, used nowhere else in the entire book except one other place, a courtyard. The night Peter said, "I do not know him," 3 times to keep himself warm at a fire just like this one. That word appears in only 2 places in everything John wrote, and Peter is standing beside both of them. The net that came up empty that night didn't stay empty. It came back so full it could barely be hauled in, and it still held everything inside it. Every fish, every thread, nothing torn, nothing lost. That's really what changed between the first time Jesus filled a net on this lake and the last. The size of the catch was never really the point. The first time, the abundance was real, but the boats and the nets couldn't hold what they were given. Everything strained, nearly broke, nearly went under. This time, with more weight in the water than the first catch ever held, nothing gave way. Whatever you think you are, the kind of person who said something by a fire you can't take back, the kind who's already gone back to the thing you knew before any of this started, that's exactly the kind of catch this net was built to hold. What's the net in your life that broke the first time around, and might still be waiting to hold the second time? 2,000 years of readers have counted those fish and argued about what the number means, and the net is still holding. Peter is still being told to feed sheep, and the number is still 153. Some details in this book were never meant to be solved. They're there to be sat with. Tradition says Peter eventually died in Rome, crucified upside down at his own request, because he didn't think he deserved to die facing the same direction his teacher had. Whether or not every detail of that story can be verified, the shape of it fits a man who spent the rest of his life remembering exactly what it felt like to be handed a net he didn't deserve to fill again. If you've never read John's Gospel slowly, start there. Pay attention to the numbers. Pay attention to the fires.